I'm Brian Sloan. I'm the research manager here at Transport for the North, and today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Ben Gardiner of Cambridge Econometrics with Professor Ron Martin, no relation, at the University of Cambridge. And then we've got a second presentation from Dr. Enrico Venino from University of Sheffield. I'm going to say a few introductory remarks about the role of TFN and our evidence base, but today's session will be about the levelling up agenda. So those two presentations will be about levelling up, which is particularly relevant to the work of TFN in our regional economic development role in a transport capacity, but also the evidence base that we're building to enable our northern public sector partners to put their investment cases to central government for investment here in the north. So hopefully you can now see my slides, and I'll move on with my presentation. I said I'd talk about the role of TFN. So Transport for the North became England's first subnational transport body. The phrase I've left, the word I've left out there is statutory transport body. So we were created in April 2018. And our role is to prepare a transport strategy in the form of our strategic transport plan for the North. We're here to provide advice to the Secretary of State for Transport about exercising transport functions across the region and coordinating the carrying out of transport functions that are exercisable by different constituent authorities. Now, in essence, what that means is that we have oversight of activities that cross those administrative boundaries across the North. So we're here to act as one voice of the North, of course, working closely with our partners in the various elements of the North, in those local authorities, for example, to create that one voice. So in practice, our statutory obligation is to present a strategic transport plan every 5 years. Now, the first of those strategic transport plans was published in 2019, and the next one will be published in 2024. But we're going to touch on some of the evidence base that we're creating that is already being produced to feed into that 2024 plan. But of course, operationally, internally, I work within the strategy and research function here at TFN, which is creating that evidence base, and that includes a technical assurance, modelling and economics team. But we also have colleagues in the wider organisation that are working on strategic roads and rail networks across those boundaries that we have here in the North. And you can see the map on the right-hand side is what we define as the North. So principally the Northwest, Northeast, Yorkshire and the Humber, Greater Manchester, Merseyside and Cheshire, and parts of North Lincolnshire. And in practice, we're not limited to the North. Economic activity, for example, and those transport links are not solely restricted to the North. So whilst we have responsibility across the North, we are mindful that our routes cross these boundaries. So we do, from time to time, consider areas beyond these. And maybe you'll be familiar with some of our work on our strategic development corridors. So what is our evidence base? So these are the things that provide a robust evidence base to inform the strategic outputs for the whole of the North. Recent examples include research on the visitor economy, freight and logistics, international trade and connectivity, innovation and R&D research, and also things like our future travel scenarios that are looking at how the world might look in the future and how we consider that as part of transport planning, which of course is very important given the changes that we've all experienced over the course of the pandemic. But I should also mention some of the upcoming research that will help to inform the strategic transport plan in the future. We have work coming up on electric vehicle charging infrastructure here in the north. Our teams are working with some of the distribution network operators in the regions to understand their investment cases, but also to underpin some of that by the research that we're conducting. And two very exciting pieces, which I think will form part of the next academic forum, are work on transport-related social inclusion, health and well-being. And we also have research due to be published on rail user insights, which again is particularly important given the impact of the pandemic on travelling. But one of the key major pieces of evidence is the Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review. The first Northern Powerhouse Independent Economic Review was published in 2016, and that formed a key part of the input to the Strategic Transport Plan in 2019. Now, I've already said that the next Strategic Transport Plan is underway, is underway and due to be published in 2024, and so it might not be a surprise to you that there is a refresh commission underway for a new independent economic review due to be published at the end of this year or early in 2023 that will input into that next strategic transport plan. I'm only going to touch on that lightly today because we've commissioned Cambridge Econometrics and SQW to undertake that work, and so Ben will be including that as part of the next presentation. But coming out of the 2016 Independent Economic Review with these key messages, that the North's performance gap with the rest of the UK is persistent and averages around 25%, and that productivity gap had widened since 2008. Now, I'm giving you the headlines from 2016, and that part of this gap was explained by deficiencies in skills, technology, investment and connectivity and transport. And what the review found was that if we were to close that gap with the rest of the UK and transform the North through improvements in these areas, that could bring an additional 850,000 jobs to the region and increase GVA by around 100 billion than under a business as usual scenario by the year 2050. Say that the work on the Independent Economic Review is underway, and these charts that I've taken from some of the early development work that Cambridge and SQW have been doing for Transport for the North. You can see from the chart on the left that heavy red line shows that productivity in the UK has continued to lag behind other advanced economies, but further that the gap between productivity growth in the North and that of the rest of the UK has continued to widen. Now, why is this significant? It's significant because the arguments put forward for investment in the North, put forward in the 2016 Independent Economic Review, remain valid today. And so we will be refreshing that and putting forward a strong case for not only to close the gap here in the UK in the north with the rest of the UK, but also that by closing that gap, we can contribute to UK growth and close that gap between the UK and our other advanced economies around the world. So I'm going to pause for breath there and ask if there are any questions.
Thanks very much for that, Brian. We don't have any questions that have come up in the Q&A at the moment, so when you're ready, we'll move on to Ben.
Oh, well, excellent. Thanks very much, Tom. So now I'll hand over to Ben and Rob. Thank you.
Hey, Ben, over to you. Just to load up your slides.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I've got my slides here, although okay, we'll go with this anyway. Actually, Ron is going to start off, but I'll just say a big thank you to Brian and Tom for inviting us to present and talk about the book. And Ron, as I said, Ron will kick off with the first couple of points, and then I'll move on with the latter points. Ron, over to you.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Brian, for the invitation to speak today. We're going to sort of kick off with some pieces of work that come out of the book that we published about 3 months ago, before the white paper on levelling up emerged. Copies of the book were in fact sent to Michael Gove and Andy Holday, and it generated an online discussion with them, so it's quite interesting. The book is really in 3 parts, very briefly. One is an analysis of the left behind places problem. The second is really why past policies, and we've had them for over 100 years, have really failed to make any major inroads into the problem. And then the final part was setting out what we felt to be some key fundamental principles for a successful levelling up program. Can't get through all of that, it's 140 pages worth. So I'm just going to sort of dip into the analysis really, and then a couple of initial sort of sections on the left behind places and perhaps some ideas about why they got left behind. And then Ben's going to take over looking at the importance of getting the metrics right, and then leading on to some of the work he's been doing for Transport for the North. So next slide, please, Ben. Next slide, please, Ben. Thanks. As you probably know, the OECD has written a lot about the increase in spatial inequalities in economic growth and performance and prosperity over the last sort of 3 or 4 decades. It reckons that across all the OECD countries, inequalities have increased by about 60% on average, and particularly between these sort of very successful areas, the so-called superstar regions and cities, and other places, sort of the left behind places that have really got sort of stuck and suffered from low prosperity, low productivity, and of course, increasingly, an expression of that through political and social discontent and disillusionment. The financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and indeed the COVID pandemic, have really exposed and highlighted these inequalities, and in fact intensified them. And now, of course, here, as in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, there's talk of trying to build back better, and levelling up or attacking the problem of left behind places become a central part of that, as indeed it is in the UK here. Next slide, please, Ben. Thank you. Just a couple of graphs here to give you an idea of the sort of what's been happening, really. Left hand one is UK, the right hand one is the United States, for different sorts of areas, standard regions and local authority districts in the UK, and for metro areas and states in the US. And effectively a somewhat similar pattern. So, a tendency towards some sort of narrowing of inequality to some extent over the post-war period, up until about the early 80s. In both countries, as you can see, and then since then, this is the coefficient of variation, and then since then, a sort of marked increase in the degree of spatial inequality, whether one looks at broad regions or local areas. Next slide, please, Ben. If we then drill down to this, in the case of the UK, that's what I want to focus on now, a couple of maps taken from our analysis in the book. These are the 372 local authority districts across the UK. We haven't got data for Northern Ireland, so it's Great Britain to be precise. These give you the cumulative percentage point differential growth in employment output relative to the national growth, divided into quartiles. And the red ones are the successful areas. These have been growing faster than the UK, the blue ones slower than the UK. And I think several points come out here very quickly. One is you've clearly got a very complex map of sort of multiple layers of spatial complexity here in terms of both growth areas and particularly, of course, slow growing or left behind areas. You've got rural areas that have been left behind. You can see some of the coastal areas in Kent and East Anglia, for example. And you can see certain cities that are blue as well, which are growing slower. And of course, large parts of the north itself and indeed of Scotland. And conversely, or in fact, similarly, I suppose, the gross value added output measure shows a very similar degree of complexity. The correlation between these two maps is about 0.73. So you've got this sort of very localized patchwork mosaic of differential performance. But there is a sort of regional dimension to this, as you can probably see, and in the sense that most of the growth areas are in the sort of southern half of the UK, roughly sort of a line from, say, the Wash to the Severn, with some exceptions to that. But you've got a complex map. Next slide, please, Ben. If we then just sort of divide these areas into settlement types, and we're using the House of Commons settlement definition here, you can see on the left-hand side employment. This is the growth of employment index back to 1981's 100. And you can see here, particularly core cities, most of which are in the north, of course, the yellow line, have not been doing very well at all. Nor of cities. London wasn't doing too well, given the impact of the early 90s recession, but it's been the fastest growing area in employment since on a broad scale. The right-hand graph gives you the labour productivity. And here, of course, London and other cities have done well, though flattening out after the financial crisis, and have a higher productivity, as you expect, than rural areas and smaller towns. The core cities, again, have lagged behind London, as you can see. Next slide, please, Ben. This is productivity, which seems to be the focus of most of government thinking on the left behind problem. This is a map for 2018, and again, it highlights that sort of area in the sort of greater southeast, if one might call it that, with outliers, but also with some areas of very lackluster productivity within the south, again, coastal areas, for example. And the right-hand graph shows you that the degree of stability in the productivity mapping, if you like, it plots 1981 against 2018, and most of the blue areas, these are northern areas, are stuck in that bottom left-hand quadrant, and they haven't, in a sense, moved out of that quadrant between 81 and 2018. So this is really a good way of showing the problem of lower productivity in many, not all, but many northern local authority districts. The red ones are the southern ones. You can see many of those are in the sort of the upper right quadrant, though there's a great scatter. So even here, there's a sort of a varied performance across even southern areas in terms of productivity between these two dates. Next slide, please, Ben. Looking at a longer perspective, which is what the book does, and I think it's very important to do that. I know in a sense we have to look forward, but to understand the problem, and indeed its sort of systemic entrenched nature, which is somewhat peculiar to the UK, not entirely unique to the UK, but we do stand out in having this long-term problem of spatial inequality. And this gives you GDP per capita across the UK. Northern Ireland only comes in after 71 because of data problems. And this is indexed to the UK or GBs 100 respectively. But the point about this graph shown in red is the way that London historically, for the last century, indeed going back even into the 19th century, has in a sense been the most prosperous, the most sort of successful part of the UK. And what that line, that top red line shows really is just how far London has pulled ahead, even from this long-standing advantage, pulled ahead since the sort of 1980s. And you can see now, you know, we've got a degree of spatial inequality, this is at the regional level, greater now than we had back a century ago, or more than a century ago in 1911. And that really is the challenge for the government in terms of its levelling up agenda. Next slide, please, Ben. So what's been going on? We can't go into all the details here because it's incredibly complex. But essentially, putting it into a nutshell, most left behind places have become left behind because the economy has indeed has happened on the global economic front, has moved into a totally different regime or phase of economic growth and development, and indeed social progress, and mainly from an industrial area to a post-industrial, service-based, more culturally focused era of development. And really what's happened to many of these areas on those maps is that they've been unable to adapt or reinvent themselves, might be a better phrase. And I think that's what's at issue here. How do cities and regions reinvent themselves when circumstances change and new challenges and opportunities arise? And what's been happening is that many of northern areas, of course, as you well know, have declined because of deindustrialization. They've just lost that manufacturing base. But they haven't shared proportionately in the growth of these highly successful, usually high-paying, knowledge-intensive business services, where London and the large towns have really scored highest. So, and the core cities themselves, or most of them, Bristol perhaps is an exception, but most of the core cities have not only suffered deindustrialization, but they've also lagged in tertiarization and particularly cubes. And they're also, on top of that, place-specific effects, which have to do with the nature of the economic environments, the ecosystems of individual places, which in a sense goes beyond structure, though it interacts with structure. And the outcome of that, or one outcome, of course, has been really an entrenched divide in skills. Next slide, please, Ben. And here's just a table with those settlement types. The left-hand column gives you the share of the growth in cubes over 81-2018. You can see London and large towns have done well. And the right-hand column is the share in the decline of production employment. And you can see there that if you go down to core cities and other cities, they've had large shares of the decline in industrial employment, but they've had very low shares in the growth of KIBs. So it's another way of showing the point I've just made. Next slide, please, Ben. And indeed, in terms of structure, we've done lots of dynamic shift share type work. And this is one example, again, the settlement types. And this gives you the breakdown of employment change over 81-2018, according to the sort of the total employment change, the purple bar, and how that's made up of a national effect, which is what would have happened in each area had it followed the national pattern, and then an industry structure effect, which has to do with its share of faster and slower growing national industries. That's the blue bar. And then the competitiveness effect, which is how any given industry has grown faster or slower in individual areas. So it's not the share, it's just how well individual industries have fared. And London, you'll see, is the area's had a positive industrial structural effect. It has a slightly negative competitiveness effect, which is of interest. Core cities have an even larger negative competitiveness effect. Rural areas and small towns, these have had a sort of positive competitiveness effect. In other words, when industries do grow there, they tend to grow slightly faster than elsewhere. So it's not only a share, it's the performance of individual industries. That graph actually demands a lot more detailed attention and analysis we can't go into here, but it gives you an idea that structure plays a role, but only part of the role. There are lots of other things going on. Next slide, please, Ben. And a skill point I made earlier, just as two graphs here, the left-hand one shows you that northern areas, blue dots, have a higher proportion of people in low-skill occupations. This is 91 and 2011. And the right-hand graph is almost like a mirror image, that northern areas have a lower share of people in high-skilled occupational groups. This is one of the key problems facing the elimination or the reduction of spatial inequalities in economic development over the coming decades, is working on the human capital side of trying to get the skill base, the reskilling, if you like, of many northern towns completely sort of reorientated. And that's essential for economic growth. Next slide, please, Ben. Now, I just want to round up my particular section with just a few comments. I've got about 3 or 4 minutes left on the London dimension of all this, which is causing quite a bit of debate, not only within academia, I should say, but also amongst policymakers and indeed between the London elite, let's call them, and others elsewhere. Now, over the last 2 or 3 decades, London has been held up as an exemplar, as a sort of example, both by academics and indeed policymakers, including some, I think, in your own region, that London is successful because it really benefits from agglomeration effects. Size and density matter. That's true to an extent, but though you could argue, well, hang on a moment, many of those cities that were highly successful in the industrial period of the 19th century, they weren't bigger than London, they were smaller than London, yet they did very well. So, there's more to this than meets the eye, I think. And indeed, Paul Krugman, back in 2016, wrote a piece where he argued that London is an exception to sort of things like rank size rule and so on, because it is big, obviously, and successful. But one of the reasons why it has to do with the fact that it is the political capital, and it contains all the main levers and power centers of the economy, of finance and politics. And I think one can't ignore that. It's as important as indeed are sort of purely economic agglomeration effects. Another argument has been that London is sort of a national economic dynamo, and you mustn't do anything in a sense to sort of stymie its growth. Boris Johnson, when he was mayor of London, repeatedly said, if you want to boost cities in the north, you invest in London. I've got quotes from him here, I won't go into it, they're quite extraordinary. A pound spent in Croydon, he says, is of far more value to the national economy than a pound spent in Strathclyde. If you want to generate jobs in Strathclyde, he says, you invest in London. So this is a typical trickle-down sort of argument. And it has some degree of veracity in the sense that London trades with the rest of the UK, of course, and therefore its growth does benefit elsewhere. But it's not the whole story. And if you look at what's been happening in terms of spatial inequalities, trickle-down obviously hasn't really worked. The other point is that London is not some sort of exemplar of free market, unregulated success. It is heavily underpinned by public spending and investment. It's also, and a comment which goes again back to the 1920s, in actual fact, been a recurring issue. It acts as a great sucking machine. It sucks in highly educated labour from across the rest of the UK, and indeed it sucks in finance. Everything like pensions and so on are all sort of all dealt with and sort of processed through London-based institutions, and there are fees every time you pass go, of course. Next slide, please, Ben. And this gives you an example of this role and power of London. This is something you'll be familiar with, that the per capita expenditure on some major areas of public economic activity, whether it be enterprise and development, science and technology, particularly transport. London per capita spending has just simply run away, leaving other areas well left behind, as I'm sure you're well aware. So this idea, in a sense, that London is some sort of beacon of successful market-based agglomeration economies, okay, but it's been heavily underwritten by huge amounts of public investment. Next slide, please, Ben. So I think when it comes to this sort of discussion of London, this idea, obviously, it trickles down, I think, is questionable. The other argument now appearing, and it's actually quite worrying from various quarters, particularly those based in London itself, is that levelling up could well mean the levelling down of London. So there's a growing opposition or expression of criticism and concern about levelling up, and it has to be, watched. The Onward group in London are watching. They're compiling indices that they feel, levelling up indices, they feel may well in fact mean the levelling down of London. This is the zero-sum argument, which of course again is somewhat vacuous. Levelling up does not necessarily mean levelling down of London. It's not about redistributing everything out of London. It's about trying to make sure that places in the north and elsewhere compete on a level playing field for resources, which allows them to actually then develop their local potential and activity in terms of reorientating, reinventing, to use the phrase I used before, their own economies. And just very finally, Ben, please. London itself, of course, is not immune from this. This graph just shows you there are boroughs in London, the right-hand side, red ones like Lewisham, Croydon, Barking, these two are left behind. So it's not simply a question of London versus the rest anyway, that there are problems within London itself. And very finally, thanks, Ben. This gives you the bottom 74 local authority areas, those which have grown slower than the national economy in terms of both employment and output over 81 2018 by settlement time, and you'll see that the majority of most categories are indeed in the north of Britain. Okay, that's my contribution. Thanks very much indeed for listening. I'll hand over to Ben. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ron. So my task here is to go through the next final couple of sections on the metrics and also the work that we're doing with TFN more recently. So what I'll do on the metrics and the mission, see, things have moved on a little bit, as Ron was alluding to, since we published the book in December 2021. So we now know a little bit more shape about what levelling up really means in terms of the missions and the sixth form of capitals, which is the kind of basic framework around which the government is kind of focusing its levelling up agenda. So we'll come on to various points on this in the following slides about how vague or not the targets are, how realistic or unrealistic the time horizon is. I guess you can guess where we stand on this. And what we think is the kind of lack of overall vision of what kind of economy, spatial economy, is actually desired or being sought if all of these missions did actually were achieved. And also looking at where the role is for kind of other main forces going on outside of the UK economy, kind of mega forces such as climate change, AI, Brexit, and really how this all fits into the levelling up agenda. So quite a lot to get through in the remaining 15-20 minutes. What we did put in, what we talked about in the book and when we presented this previously, before we knew exactly what the levelling up white paper was going to say, was to group the kind of metrics of how you might define levelling up or measure it across three broad categories. The first is political, which is the slightly more cynical viewpoint, saying levelling up is really just about protecting red wall seats and maintaining the ruling party in power, and also to kind of stem this sense of discontent. On the economic side, most of which we cover in the book when we look at productivity, wages, skills, occupations, jobs. These are all a more standard type of most outcome indicators, really, you could say, of what defines a successful area and are often the easiest to measure. Less measurable or harder to measure on the economic side are things like the infrastructure, where you have things like the travel times to city centres or travel times to kind of major agglomerations, access to finance, government spending, or we're well aware that there are various funds available now, and how you add those up. In the book, we did a Herculean task, not myself, but others did a Herculean task of working out the funds available to the different areas over the last, I think, 40 odd years. So much so that the Department of Levelling Up actually contacted us to get hold of the data because they didn't have it. And then finally, on the environmental social side, even harder to measure in some cases, particularly when it comes to energy environment and things like institutional strength and life expectancy, well-being. These are all worthwhile to measure, but again, are often interrelated with the economic indicators. Often they are, stronger areas economically are often those which have the healthier workforce and ones with stronger sense of well-being and happiness as well. So it's not that these are at all exclusive from each other. The kind of Venn diagram indicates that there's a heavy degree of overlap there. But if we move on to what we're actually faced with in the white paper, I've shamelessly just copied this because it was easier than trying to think of anything else to put down. we have this the six capitals framework, which at least is something. I think it's we think we're writing currently a quick plug for a paper on this, which will be coming out before too long. I think regional studies. To look at reflect on the white paper and what it's really saying. So there are some positives about this approach in the sense that it gives you an organized structure around which to base your policy. There are origins and links with the kind of inclusivity agenda and well-being, where I think the six capitals approach stems from. It's certainly not a new approach. It's been around for kind of at least a decade or two, I think. And there are obviously deriving from this a series of measurable missions. Still unsure why they're called missions and not targets. Perhaps that's because they're less accountable if they don't go quite to plan. But still, there are a set of these 12 missions on which to base success or not. Now, our view on this, on the kind of bullets on the right-hand side, is a few limitations on this, having said that there are some positives. Firstly, seemingly the big one that's missing is the environmental and natural capital, especially given one of the mega forces around is the whole climate change, net zero, circular economy side of things, which seems to be somewhat missing from this framework. Also, the ability to actually measure and track progress at the regional and local level becomes very difficult, depending on what spatial scale we need to go down to, particularly when you're starting to look at institutional strengths and intangible capitals, let alone the whole missing area of natural capital, which again is often even harder to measure. And although there is a framework in place, we do feel that there's a kind of some lack of theory or lack of structure behind it. The diagram here looks structural, but you start to unpick and ask questions of what are the interrelations and trade-offs between these forms of capital, then it starts to unravel a bit, because as it stands, it kind of rules nothing out as being a useful form of investment without prioritizing, when we know resources are scarce, what actually to invest in. You can't invest in everything. So where are the priorities? Where is the interrelation and understanding about that? So all of it seems just still a little bit vague, and maybe there's time to sort these things out, but we're perhaps expecting a little bit more from the white paper, and there's obviously more to come. In terms of getting the mission and the metrics right, well, we've already got some of the metrics. In the book, we use metrics, primarily economic ones, to both identify and evaluate progress towards leveling up, because we do feel that you need to understand which areas have been left behind and need leveling up, as well as undertake the policy of doing the leveling up itself. And until you do that, you need to define on what basis you're saying an area has been left behind or not. So it becomes tricky. The framework is good, but it doesn't help you necessarily say, well, which are the areas that need most attention. But the typologies that Ron mentioned in the last parts of his slides do help a little bit in terms of starting to unpick what is a very complex problem. So there are also, I'll come on to in a minute, the whole issue of at what level the targets and the metrics are rolled out. Is it top down? Is it bottom up? So I'll skip for now and come on to that in a minute or two. Time horizon issue, very important. Basically, we've been saying this in the book and for some time that, and others have as well, that this whole inequality and spatial imbalance has taken decades to develop and emerge to where we observe it now, to the point where back when I was starting to do this, it was north-south Italy, and now we've evolved to being compared to east-west Germany. It hasn't got any better. The analogies, I think we've run out of. Possibly maybe we'll get to North-South Korea eventually. Who knows? But if we take the German example, which others have done, I think the three points that come out of that is that in order for this to do, and it transcends the time horizon issue, you need serious amounts of money, serious amounts of commitment to reform, and a serious timeline. And purely on the time horizon issue, just taking it to 2030 is absolutely not enough. Germany's been reunifying since the early 90s and still hasn't got there, despite the trillions of euros that have been pumped into the economy. But there is a consensus and there is a commitment to reform that backs up that money, which we feel is somewhat lacking still in the UK. I won't dwell too much on this. It is developed quite a lot in the book about the types of spatial policy model that can be followed by governments. We identified 3 different types: the targeted, place sensitive, and place based. What I would say is that from what we've observed in the missions of the white paper, most of it seems to be the spatially targeted type. There seems to be very little where local areas are in charge of their own agenda of what levelling up means to them, which would define what place-based really means. So again, despite the overtures towards more devolution, which is probably the main thing that's changed in the white paper and the policy since then, it still seems to be driven very centrally, and the targets seem to be top down rather than bottom up. And so will levelling up be enough? Well, short answer, no. Obviously this is a comprehensive paper and the first proper attempt to really identify and look at the issue for 70, 80 years since the Barlow report. But we don't really think there's enough of an understanding of how we got there and the interrelationships and complexities between the different measures of economy, society, environment. And we also don't think there is much of a vision, because unless you have an ideal, as is Germany, where they effectively have the policy of kind of parity between East and West, that is their goal. Unless there's a vision, how do you know you've really ever got there, rather than just putting an arbitrary date of 2030 on the missions, thinking that they're all going to come good by then. So we don't think there's a really overall defining goal or picture. And as we know, and as Brian alluded in his first set of slides, things are actually moving in the wrong direction. The Bloomberg analysis has been released recently, I'm sure people are aware of, has shown on most measures or metrics, London is actually pulling ahead again. So it's not looking particularly good for the levelling up agenda, even in its early inception phase. So I'll quickly move on, because I'm conscious of time, to briefly talk about what we've been doing for TFN and how this relates to the levelling up agenda. So quickly talk about 2 projects, one called Capabilities, Local Data and Narratives, which is just finishing, and the other on scenario development, which is just starting. So both of these are also undertaken with SQW, and slight step away from the levelling up agenda, more operational, but there are obviously links, as you will see. So the Capabilities, Local Data Narratives, was basically to look at the standard 4+3 model, which I'm sure most people are aware of, with the capabilities, prime and enabling, that the original independent economic review established, and look at the developments since then, of which there have been quite a few, in terms of Brexit, COVID, levelling up agenda, whole devolution, metro mayors, net zero agenda. We didn't include, obviously, Ukraine and the energy crisis. That's the latest one to kind of blow in, but nonetheless, that was enough to start with. So it's really about understanding what's changed, the reasons for these developments, and whether the capabilities and also the foundational economy, which we did a reasonable amount of work reviewing, have stood up to these changes, and whether they were still as kind of strong as they were before. Putting that together with a review of data, also working with the Data City to bring up some more nuanced sector detail, linking into the Pan-North agenda and consulting with partners to see whether there were broader metrics to include in a set of new pan-Northern European economic scenarios, and generally feeding this through into what the Northern economic narrative should be in the sense of an insights, issues, choices paper, which I believe will be released before too long. So it wasn't a complete update of the Independent Economic Review from 2016, more of a review, not even a refresh in that sense. This is the timetable, so I'm not going to dwell too much here, but just breaks down the various work packages, work streams, as to how they evolved since the beginning of the year through to where we are now. So I'll move on quickly from there, conscious of time. We can always come back if people want. Just to look at the key findings. Again, this is a very edited version. Again, I think the report will come out very soon. So on the evidence base, broadly speaking, the feeling was the 4+3 was fit for purpose. Stronger primes more recently have been advanced manufacturing and energy, so some primes doing better than others. But there were also emerging evidence of other capabilities outside the framework, such as food and drink, engineering, construction, circular economy. And the foundation economy was also interesting to look at. We established there were just under 5 million jobs, so 67, almost 70% of all Northern employment is in the foundational economy. So some useful evidence base there to build on for future work. And on the scenarios side, as you might expect, emerging themes included a lot on the energy environment side, also inequality, living standards, and more recently to do with COVID-19, working from home, working from office, that kind of big debate, which again is seemingly missing from the white paper, despite the fact it could have huge implications for how we live and work. And we also talked about whether scenarios should be both positive and negative, which general consensus was it should be. It's not just about the sunny uplands or purely aspirational targets. It's also about what if things don't work as planned. And the metrics linking in with the theme should go well beyond just the standard economic ones of GVA and jobs. And this is the final thing, just to show the kind of various choices that everything was distilled into in terms of where the Northern Powerhouse review goes forward in terms of key questions about what it should align to. For example, should it be fully aligned with levelling up, or should it be more of a bottom up driven by the North itself? So second and final project, just to briefly talk about, is what we've just started again with SQW on scenario development. Here there are three kind of main work streams. One on a general kind of pulling together of collaborative workshops, narratives, high-level ambitions, looking at metrics, geographies, time periods, all in this kind of large kind of thinking phase, scoping, talking with various stakeholder groups and with various experts involved, distilling that into a set of measurable scenarios, and then doing the modelling over the summer to look at how we quantify these things from the global, the national to the local, and then finally reporting all of that in a non-technical, accessible way, as we always do. And so on this side of things with the scenarios, obviously, again, the same things come up about the range of indicators moving beyond the traditional to the more contemporary indicators, such as including energy environment indicators, well-being, things like that. But also open questions still to be decided and discussed about to what extent the scenarios should be levelling up missions or something different. My own view on this, not that that's feeding in necessarily, is that I think the North will be around a lot longer than the levelling up agenda. So I would urge people to take their own views and force their own agenda on this, rather than stick directly to what the levelling up white paper is saying. And on the scenarios, we want to move away a little bit, I think, from just the rest of UK productivity matching, which was the kind of cornerstone of the previous IER. And look at more North-specific issues, so that there's more of the kind of North's own voice in this. And also that there's enough space between these scenarios to make them unique and not just kind of shades of the same kind of view. And as I said, reflecting both optimistic and pessimistic views, because as we know, if anything tells us over the last 5 or 6 years, there's any number of shocks that can come in that are completely unknown, and that we have to take the rough with the smooth. Okay, I will stop there, and we've got a bit of time for questions, I believe. Thanks very much.
Well, excellent. Thanks very much, Ben. Thanks very much, Ron. I really enjoyed the presentation. And before I ask Tom if there's any questions in the chat box, I do have one or two things that I wanted to say beforehand, and I do have a question, so I'm going to use my privilege as chair to get that in first. So yeah, just to highlight the work that you've been talking about there towards the end, Ben. That Transport for the North will be publishing the capabilities, that earlier part of the work, in due course, because of course that's an important part of feeding into the economic scenarios development with our partners across the North. So that will feed into the workshops where partners will decide which economic scenarios and, as you mentioned, which metrics they want to see modelled in the work. But we will be publishing that work probably over the course of the summer. It is being signed off through the TFN governance process, and we've been sharing that work with the group of MP11. So that's the 11 local enterprise partnerships across the north of the UK. I'm going to be very careful not to be drawn on any of the political aspects of some of the presentation, particularly how long the levelling up agenda might be around, or the comments made by a former Mayor of London. But I do agree the levelling up agenda, if it's to be effective, does need to be a long-term policy. And you presented statistics, Ron, on investment in transport in London and the South East. Well, of course, it's our job as Transport for the North to put together that evidence base, which would strongly support an argument for investment in connectivity to help make the economy of the North move more efficiently and effectively, so that we can boost that productivity and close that gap, not just with the rest of the UK, but also make a positive contribution to overall growth. I do have one or two quick sort of questions. I think it might be for you, Ron, particularly given that we talked about that sort of almost a subsidy for London. I wonder if you had any thoughts on to what extent this strategy of moving some of those public sector roles out into the region might have a positive effect on regions such as the North, moving, government offices, or some of those workers in those government offices to the region, or is there potentially a conflict where sort of public sector will be competing for those skills that might actually be opportunities for the North? I'm sorry, I hope I'm not drifting into Enrico's presentation here. Oh, sorry, you're on mute, Ron. Sorry. That's it.
Yeah. I think the idea of decentralising certain parts of London-based departments, government departments, is potentially a useful one. But what obviously is important is that, first of all, the amount of decentralisation, just decentralising a few hundred jobs, I think is not going to have much of an impact. It depends on precisely what functions and what powers are decentralised along with those jobs. In other words, what do the elements of the Treasury in is it Wolverhampton or somewhere, and then a bit of something else somewhere else? That's fine. But if the organs of and the channels of decision making nevertheless are focused back down in London and become London orientated, then it's likely to not really affect much change. I mean, ideally, what I think, and indeed the team who wrote the book the model we have in our mind, that in a way you could argue is essential in the long run for achieving any degree of a more equitable distribution of prosperity and performance across the UK, would be one where you move to a federal structure. Germany is often used as an example, perhaps overused. But, in Germany, for example, with the federal structure it has there, there's both the federal level decision making, but each of the states, the Länder, have a high degree of power and fiscal powers and decision making. There's also the issue that the economic structure of that federal arrangement is very interesting. For example, in terms of finance, London completely swamps and dominates the UK. Not only sort of big finance, but also venture capital as well. That's where most of the venture capital firms are. We've got some data for this in this new paper. That if you go to Germany, which I've studied, in comparison to UK, the venture capital market is more or less almost evenly distributed amongst about 8 different centres across Germany. And then you look at where investments are made, and again, it's more or less an equal distribution of investments. So just one isolated example of the way in which institutions are spatially arranged, the architecture of key institutions is absolutely key. So coming back to government departments, if one can actually ensure that key decision-making parts of departments are decentralized, and moreover take on board as an integral part of their operation the circumstances of the regions in which they are located, then that may well achieve something useful. But otherwise, I'm a bit sceptical. It's a sort of political device to actually a bit of a smokescreen to say, here we are, we're decentralizing government. Decentralization is not the same as devolution. This is the key thing. You can decentralize government departments or bits of them. What about the devolution of power and decision making? So that's my sort of response to that. Quick response.
That's very interesting, Ron. And you mentioned investment there. I did see some, I think they're experimental statistics from the ONS on the catchy titled gross fixed capital formation, which I think is a proxy for investment. And that shows quite an uneven distribution, with obviously London dominating. I think the sort of wider southeast benefiting from its proximity to London, but the rest of the UK lagging some way behind, not only in the total investment from those statistics, but also when you look by sector as well. There seems to be a strong performance for London and southeast.
Well, the British Business Bank have recently published one of their surveys. It's the first of their regional surveys, and it shows quite clearly how London and its surrounding hinterland, mostly sort of commuter hinterland, really dominates venture capital and small firm SME access to venture capital. So the whole nexus of the financial machine is focused in and around London, and it differs quite dramatically from the case in, say, Germany. So it's quite an interesting, and I don't think it's purely coincidence then that you get a much more even distribution of investment in SMEs in Germany than you do in the UK.
Just to add as well on the capital investment side of things, we've already done one paper on the regional capital that the ONS has published and how that links to regional productivity. And we've got some work coming out, hopefully before too long, looking at the Brexit effect of that, or at least the referendum effect, because as people know, investment plateaued or basically stopped growing after 2016 at a national level, and that can be largely attributed to the kind of uncertainty created by the Brexit vote. And we've used our previous estimates of the link between regional productivity and capital per worker to look at how the Brexit referendum effect has affected productivity across the regions, which has some interesting results, but are still funded from when they're published.
Oh, thanks very much, both. I could go on, but Tom, do we have any questions in the chat box or?
Yes, we do. We've had a couple of questions come through for Ben and for Ron. The first is a question from James. Do you agree that there is too much focus on enhancing skills in the levelling up and regional development dialogue? James adds that it feels a little bit like we're trying to fix a leaky bath by turning the tap on more, with northern universities already producing over 100,000 graduates per year.
Right, I don't know. Do you want to take that, Ben, or do you want me to?
I can say my bit because I've got to go. I've got another meeting coming up for, well, it was minus 1 minute, but anyway. Yeah, I mean, the education and the skilled workers are an important part of it, but it's having the activity there to keep them in the regions and having that demand side as well. Supply, you know, everyone seems to focus a lot on the supply side when it comes to catching up, but there's got to be enough for people to do and not want to go to London, as Ron was talking about, and get on that escalator and then come back later in life, whatever. So it's part of it, but it's absolutely not all of it. And we should remember that, as I said, the foundational economy is almost 70% of the North's kind of what the North does, and so those graduates will contribute to that a bit. But there's also got to be a focus on the rest of the economy as well, and not just the high-end bits. Right, I'll stop there and leave it to Ron to kind of finish off.
Thanks very much, Ben.
I basically agree with that. I think you know, it is as much an issue of demand as well as supply. If you're simply generating lots of graduates who then drift southwards, you know, to take up jobs in areas which their degree actually doesn't correspond. I mean, my own university is guilty of this, churning out engineers and mathematicians who then become investment bankers. And they could argue there are all sorts of moral questions there about, is that a good use of education in terms of what we know about investment banking and how that's sort of performed in the last decade or so. So I think the demand, you're generating enough of local jobs to employ skilled people is essential, but it's not all about graduates. And I think this is where I would actually take a point. I mean, if you define skills, it's not just about graduates, it's about people who've got good sort of apprenticeship skills, good technical skills, good adaptable and flexible skills, and in all sorts of walks of life and occupations. So I think we shouldn't get too fixated just about graduates, though they are obviously very important. The other thing is, and I would really strongly emphasize this, it's not just about generating lots of skilled people and then saying, well, we haven't got enough work for these people, and you find graduates driving taxis. There's also the other side of this coin, and that's how we value people who do what we would probably define, wrongly in my view, as unskilled jobs, like caring, for example. Social caring it's a skilled job. It's absolutely pathetically paid because society doesn't value that sort of work. So this is the other side of the equation. I think it's not just about generating skills. There needs to be a real societal debate about how we value things like, for example, social care, delivery, you know, the sort of logistics side of things, people working in the health sector generally. There are lots of occupations which are not valued properly, in my view. And the pandemic has really exposed that issue, where a lot of the people who have kept the economy going are amongst the lowest paid. So it's not just skills as skills, it's actually value of people and value of the work that they do. So I'd have that sort of very strong caveat against simply getting too caught up with talking about we need more graduates. We need also to actually revalue the meaning of work, the sorts of work that are done, which are actually crucial to keeping society and the economy going. Thanks. Sorry for a bit of a rant there, but
no, I think it's you make a very important point, Ron, and yeah, certainly one that I often have in mind when I hear the term highly skilled workers. I think, well, actually, I'm very aware of the people who are also making the function on the economy function on a day-to-day basis. And as you rightly say, sorry, not rightly say, but as you highlight, they are amongst the lowest paid in society. Tom, I think there might be one more question. Is there in the chat box?
There is, yes, a question from Jack, Ron, as to what you think is the best killer argument as to why levelling up doesn't have to mean levelling down of other regions, even if in practice with a limiting funding pot, it will mean a reprioritisation of funds. Thank you, Jack, for that question.
Yeah, that is a very, very good and difficult question to answer. One answer would be, for example, well, perhaps there does need to be a redistribution of resources, which you might say, well, that would actually level down London's progress. But I put it to you, let me answer it in a roundabout way. A typical academic, I'm sort of obfuscating and answering a question here. But London seems to have reached the point in its economic growth where ever more public investment in public infrastructure, particularly transport, is needed simply to keep London functioning. It's like the Red Queen, isn't it? To keep running, it's ever sort of difficult to keep the machine going unless you actually have more and more investment. So, we have Crossrail, now Crossrail 2 being talked about, other things, of course, in terms of investment and so on in London. So this is where I think, in fact, there's a real question that, how much more of that does London need? Because on the one hand, it generates all this activity, it also generates congestion and indeed, quality of life in London. The surveys suggest that London does not come out top on quality of life indicators. So there are all those sorts of issues involved here. But I suppose what I mean by it won't necessarily mean levelling down of London. I'm talking really about a level playing field. Now, a level playing field, you can obviously level up one end by levelling down the other, by sort of shifting resources. The other way is in the sense, well, there are real potential. There's real potential in many northern cities and areas, which is not being realised. And if one can actually sort of stimulate that and support it in various ways, okay, it may mean a bit of a redirection of resources. But at the same time, by the way, London trades more internally with the rest of the UK than it does externally. Some recent data from the Board of Trade, from the HMRC shows, which is interesting. If you actually stimulate northern parts of the country in terms of giving them a greater ability to develop their own economies, that will then rebound on being good for London. So what I'm saying here is I'm not trying to make a sort of an emphatic point. What I guess I'm saying is that the discussion of all this has been really one-sided, and there are two sides to the equation. There's a cost and a benefit side, and you get organisations like the City UK, the organ that the London City Corporation has as its lobbying device. It comes out, it trots out with report after report. Oh, London generates a fiscal surplus, etc., etc. There's hardly a mention in any of that work about the costs of London in terms for itself and on the national economy. And as parting point, because I think I've gone on too long, I just redirect your interest, if you like, to the work of people like Shax and others who have actually calculated what the cost of the financial sector in London has cost the UK economy as a whole, and mainly, I should add, parts of the UK economy outside of London. I would really redirect you to his sort of work actually on this. So I've gone round about the question a bit, I confess, but I think it's a debate to be had, and it's not been had properly, that there are costs and benefits to be had here. So it's not simply a case of levelling up means levelling down.
Well, thank you very much, Ron. I would love to discuss this further, and well, I can certainly indicate that you're certainly preaching to the converted in terms of my ears. But we must press on, and so the next speaker we have Dr. Enrico Venino, and hopefully Enrico is going to be perhaps sharing with us some insights into solutions to the problem, as he's going to be talking about identifying industrial renewal paths of places for levelling up. Over to you, Enrico.
Hi, Enrico. Over to you. We can see you on the screen now.
Okay. Hi, do you hear me? Sorry, I'm having problems with the control of the software.
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, so I'll be sharing my slide. Do you see my slides?
We haven't got those yes, I'm afraid. Would you like me to share and run your slide deck?
Yes, in case. Thank you.
There we go. That's on the screen now.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you all for the invitation to the seminar. So just a little bit about myself. I'm an assistant professor in economics at the University of Sheffield. My research is mostly focusing on urban economics, regional economics, and productivity. And today I'm going to discuss with you and present what has been the result of one of the outcomes of the academic secondment that I spent at BASE last year. And I would like to acknowledge as well the funding of ESRC that allowed me to spend some time with colleagues in London. What I'm going to discuss, basically, this is a project we developed together with the Cities and Local Growth unit at BASE, which try to identify basically potential pathways for industrial renewal for places across the countries and how this could be beneficial as well for leveling up. Next slides, please. So what we're seeing and what is exactly wrong, and Ben started discussing earlier, is that we see wide spatial productivity imbalances in the UK. Why this is important for leveling up, first of all, because we know that productivity is one of the main drivers of economic growth and long-term economic performance. And the problem is that the UK has had a very long-standing productivity gap with the major competitors in Europe and also elsewhere. This is not just a problem of comparison across countries, but we do observe as well very large spatial disparities, both across and within nations and regions within the UK. So, for instance, if you have a look at the diagram in figure 1, we can see that even within regions such as London, for instance, as Ron discussed earlier, we could see that neighborhoods and places within a region have very different levels of productivity. And for instance, we do observe that some of the places across regions in the north, such as, for instance, in Manchester or as well in the Midlands, have higher values of productivity than, for instance, some of the worst performing places within the Greater London Authority. These imbalances, these partial imbalances, have been persistent, and as Ron has highlighted before, they've been widening over time as well. This might be explained partially by London's outstanding role as a highly productive global city, but as well, this is due to some of the formerly industrialized regions in the north of the UK lagging now behind, which overall, combining the two things together, make the UK one of the most spatially unequal countries in the UK. So, stemming from the Leveling Up white paper, we know that exactly reducing somehow these very large spatial inequalities in terms of regional productivity across the UK, mainly through exactly the catch-up of regions outside of London, could address partially this productivity gap of the UK vis-à-vis international competitors, but as well it could ensure, for instance, economic growth and prosperity for all across the country. Next slide, please. So we started our work, first of all, by looking at, okay, what are the main drivers of these productivity differences? So several factors have been identified as possible drivers of the spatial productivity imbalances, each of them contributing somehow to this spatial productivity puzzle. Probably one of the most important factor identified as a potential driver of the spatial productivity disparity is human capital. So we know that human capital is spatially unevenly distributed across the country. Most of the time, high-skilled jobs are located, of course, are concentrated in the main urban areas in order to benefit from the forces of agglomerations. And we know, as we can see in figure 2, that exactly places with a higher share of high-skilled workers are also those performing better in terms of productivity. So this leads some of the studies in the literature to think about exactly, okay, this is a problem of composition of skills of those places rather than other intrinsic characteristics of these places. However, as Ron was discussing before, answering one of the questions, there is probably a focus. We are focusing probably too much on the supply side of the equation, given that exactly by simply increasing the demand, simply increasing the supply of skills will not automatically translate into an increase in demand for those skills. And those definitely in this case we will have a mismatch between demand and supply, which will somehow need to be addressed either by some of these high-skilled workers moving where those skills are required, such as for instance London, or of course an effect in terms of wages. This is probably as well driven by the fact that there is an over-focus whenever we talk about skills, about graduate jobs, so education basically, in ever increasing the level of education in the country, while instead there is a smaller, more limited debate in terms of how we can promote upskilling, especially of people in so-called low-skilled jobs, and incremental improvements in the skills that could be used as well by companies and firms located elsewhere. A second driver of potential driver of these spatial inequalities in terms of productivity is investment in infrastructure. So we know that the UK has invested less than comparable other countries, for instance, especially in Europe, and that the investment in infrastructure being mostly skewed towards capital investments. This is, of course, is one of the motivations, but again, exactly, it will depend on whether we know that, for instance, exactly investments in infrastructure usually runs in two ways. So on one side, yes, it could bring more economic activity in left behind the peripheral regions, but on the other side, it could as well make it more easy for businesses and workers to move instead to the most agglomerated, high-skilled, high-wages places. Another important driver is as well the what we can refer as the suboptimal institutional and governmental institutional setting. So in here we know that the UK is one of the most centralized countries in the UK according to the OECD, where local authorities and even the growing combined authorities have very limited fiscal and administrative autonomy. This, of course, is going to hinder their possibility to develop place-based policies, which might be very beneficial, in particular for peripheral and left-behind places. And of course, in this case, we would need further financial autonomy, more budget devolved to the local authorities. And as Ron was suggesting before, exactly not just decentralization, but devolution of powers to local authorities. Another factor that I would like to discuss, and is going to be the main focus of the presentation today, is instead exactly differences in the local business environment across regions and as well in the industrial structure of places. In this sense, we can look at two different differences. So despite some studies and evidence suggesting that there is not a a large variety, a large difference in terms of the industrial composition of places, across the country, especially if we look at the very aggregate level, at the very industrial aggregate level. In reality, we do observe very large differences. First of all, we observe within industry differences in productivities, and this is true particularly in terms of productivity gaps driven by the so-called happy few firms. These are very large, highly productive, usually internationalized, and as well skill and innovative intensive companies, which are those who are mostly driving the productivity gap across regions within the same industry, given that most of those happy few firms are usually located in the southeast. So in this case, exactly, industrial policy should focus on promoting upskilling and upskilling of the laggards rather than helping promoting the champions within industry champions. The second difference is as well the across-region sectoral composition, which is significantly different, especially we go down the subsectoral level. In this case, we can observe that even within the same industry, we do see that different tasks and different productive processes are spatially clustered differently across the country, depending on the level of productivity, the level of complexity and knowledge intensity of those activities. With, of course, as you would expect, the most productive, complex and knowledge-intensive activities, which are located in London and the southeast of the country, even within the same very well-defined industry. So in this case, these very large heterogeneities that we observe within industry might raise concern regarding the design of the so-called place-neutral industrial policies, which are designed to suit basically all sub-geographies in the same way. Next slide, please. So given these facts, we need to consider that exactly places across the country, in particular in terms of the industrial structure and the economic structure, are very different. And these differences could shape the possibilities for the future economic development. So, for instance, instead of focusing on narrowly focusing on few specific high-tech, high-skill industries, policy intervention should probably instead focus on the local capabilities of regions and try to build on those capabilities and on their comparative advantage in order to enable an industrial transition, an industrial branching, in particular promoting the diversification of these regions towards higher added values industries, which are nevertheless related to the existing economic structure. This is the main focus of the smart specialization strategy and the related theories that have been developed in the past decade, which exactly insist on leverage existing strengths, recombining the knowledge and the capabilities that are already existing in the locality, and to support in this way basically a new path of entrepreneurial discovery by exactly branching towards new productive trajectories and, more importantly, towards more new industries which are with a higher added value than the existing one. This is exactly somehow in contrast with the one-size-fits-all kind of policies developed at the national level, and the generalist industrial strategy prioritizing mostly high-tech sectors. While this type of policies might be beneficial in particular for leading regions with the capabilities to invest in high-tech and the skills, for instance, to invest in high-tech sectors, this might not be exactly as suitable for lagging behind regions, for which instead exactly path renewal and incremental extension of what is already in there can be more effective, in particular to help them to diversify and become more resilient to economic crisis. So this theory is empirically based, first of all, in the identification of comparative advantage of places, the concept of relatedness between economic activities, and as well on the evaluation of the technological complexity and productivity of the production processes and how these production processes are sparse and dispersed across space unevenly. The next slide, please. So what we have done in this project basically was to try to apply this smart specialization strategy framework to the UK case in order to identify potential venues for economic diversification and new industrial paths for places across the country. So this is based on a three-step process that we developed during the secondment. First of all, exactly the identification of existing capabilities and comparative advantages of places across the country. So this is basically to understand what are the capabilities and in which specific economic activities some regions are specialized. Then to develop, based on that, a measure of relatedness between industry, where with the term relatedness we define the complementarity between different sectors based on the skill they use, based on the knowledge they use, but also based, for instance, on the suppliers or on the final markets, which are common to different sectors. We do then combine these two things together in order to estimate a sort of relatedness density of each sector. So basically a measure of how closely related a sector is to the rest of the local existing industrial mix. So we combine this with data on industrial productivity at the very local level in order to develop what we define as a local index, an index of local renewal industrial path. So this is used then to identify opportunities for new industrial trajectories for each different place, each different local labor market across the UK. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to first of all discuss very briefly about the data and the methodology we developed in order to achieve that, and then I'm going to showcase part of exactly the potential of this analysis by providing a few case studies. So first of all, we'll focus on a few specific places based on some of the socioeconomic characteristics of these places. So for instance, we focus in the examples on most deprived areas or second-tier cities, former industrial towns, and so on and so forth. But as well, for instance, looking at possible how this analysis can be used in order to perform some strategic industrial analysis, in particular when we try to identify which are the best places which could be eligible to develop, for instance, some of the key strategic industries identified by the government, such as clean energy, life science, fintech, creative and digital industries, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. So in terms of data methodology, sorry about the math in there. I'm going to try to explain it in very simple words. But basically what we try to do is to use publicly available data. So data which are available to everyone. And that's the reason why exactly this study could be easily replicated by anyone, basically. So we use data about employment in each industry subsector at the 4-digit level, so very granular identification of subsectors and subsectors across the UK, and travel to work areas, which are, as you might know, areas of commuting zones, or we can define them as local labor markets. So we use data for the period 2015 to 2019, so basically living outside the COVID and post-COVID period. And we combine that with information about productivity, again at the 4-digit level for industries, which is based on gross value added for the same period. Unfortunately, for the productivity analysis, we do not have information at that granular level for the financial sector, and that's why this sector will be excluded from the analysis, unfortunately. In terms of methodology, we estimate exactly a measure of relatedness between industries based on the so-called co-occurrence analysis. So the co-occurrence analysis is used in order to evaluate the frequency with which regions have a so-called revealed comparative advantage, so have a specialization in a given industry, and how often that the regions have simultaneously specialization and strength in two industries at the same time. And we compare that with how often that's the case across across regions and in respect to all the other different industry pairs. So we start by measuring exactly the revealed comparative advantage of each travel to work area for each industry based on this Balassa index. So basically this is nothing else than what's the share of a given industry in a given region in respect to the rest of the country. If this is larger than the national average, then we say that that region has a comparative advantage in that industry. And then we measure the occurrences of these comparative advantages across travel to work areas, comparing two at a times all industry pairs. So how often exactly travel to work area are as a joint comparative advantage, both in industry I and in industry J, and we do that relative to all other region industries combinations. So in this way, we build a matrix of revealed comparative advantage co-occurrences, okay? So reporting exactly the number of times two industries have jointly an RCA in the same travel to work area. And we use this in order to derive a measure of relatedness between industries using the so-called Gazani Index. So basically, this is a proxy of how industries are related to each other. This is based on employment in this analysis, but it's been done, for instance, in other studies by using co-occurrence of patents, for instance, across different technologies, or as well co-occurrence of skills. So how skilled workers basically can be used, and specific skills can be used by different sectors. And this could give us a proxy of how two industries are related in terms of the skills they use, the production processes they implement, and so on and so forth. So we estimate then this related density, which is simply how strongly related an industry is to the rest of the industrial structure in the region. And we combine all of this together with measures of productivity in order to derive an index of local renewal industrial path, which will help us to identify industries, in particular regions, which could be which could represent potential trajectories for diversification from low productive industries to higher added values industries. In order to do that, we differentiate between two sets of industries. First of all, the so-called rooted industries, or industries which are already present in the region, and as well between we look at so-called pioneering industries, which are instead industries which are not present for now, which are not currently present in a region, but might be exactly entrants in the future. Next slide, please. So we start first of all by looking at the highest values for the index we developed of local renewal industrial path. And in particular, we focus on pioneering industries, so those industries which are not present in our region yet. So as you can see, for instance, the highest value in our index is for the industry of motion picture, videos, and television programs distribution activities in the travel to work areas of Medway. Okay, so this is a travel to work area very close to the Greater London Authority, and based on the relatedness of the existing industries already present in this travel to work area, and as well based on the higher productivities of this industry in respect to the industries already present, we identify that this could be a very good option for industrial diversification in this travel to work area. We do the same exactly for many different other combination of sectors and travel to work areas across the country. And as you can see, for instance, we find as well very high levels for manufacture of synthetic rubber in Manchester, leasing of intellectual property in Colchester, but as well stuff like manufacture of iron plaster in Wolverhampton and Walsall. So it is interesting to note that many of these sectors that feature here in the top 10 are also those industries which are which have a very high value for this index for many different regions. So these are possible very good candidates for diversification for many different regions across the country. Next slide, please. What we do then is to start instead looking at the specific analysis on the local industrial renewal path for specific local labor markets across the country. As I said before, we started looking at different typologies of regions and cities. So first of all, for instance, we started with second-tier cities, but as well looking at post-industrial towns or the most deprived areas in the country and so on and so forth. So, for instance, here we are looking at one of the second-tier cities in the country. Of course, I couldn't not mention Sheffield, given that I'm based there. And in this diagram, the first split between, as I said before, pioneer industries and rooted industries, so those who are not existing and those who are already located in there. And we basically try to look at each of these dots representing different industries. So the size of the bubbles, the size of the dot represent how specialized this specific travel to work area is in each of the industries. While instead, if we look at the horizontal and vertical axis, on the horizontal axis, we have the measure of latent density. So the farther to the right an industry is, the more related it is to the rest of the industrial structure in the area. While instead, if we look at the vertical axis, we have productivity. So the higher up an industry is, the more productive it is. So of course, ideally, we would like to see many dots with very large, exactly very large dots along an imaginary 45 degrees line. And in particular, towards the top, in which we have very high relatedness with the rest of the economic structure and very high productivity. As we can see instead, for instance, for the city of Sheffield. Next slide. Thank you. So as you can see instead, we do observe that the local labor market of Sheffield is mostly specialized, is highly specialized in industries which are closely related to the rest of the city, of the industrial sector, but which have very low productivity levels, such as exactly non-metallic mineral products, basic metals, and other type of metal production. Next slide. If instead we would like to understand towards which specific sectors the city of Sheffield should diversify, we do observe that there are already some industries in the local labor market which are somehow related with the rest of the economic and industrial structure, but with very high level of productivities. But as you can see from the size of the bubble, are not one of the main strengths of the local labor market yet. These are, for instance, the wholesale of food, beverage, and tobacco, but as well as the manufacture of refined petroleum products or renting of motor vehicles. If we discuss instead the potential industries which are not present yet in the local labor market, but could be very good candidates for industrial diversification. Next slide, please. We can look on the diagram on the left-hand side of the pioneer industries, which have a relatively high related density, so are highly related with what is already present in the local labor market, and has as well higher levels of productivity, such as, for instance, the production of synthetic rubber, the wholesale of tobacco, but as well other type of services, such as renting of air transport equipment and many others. Next slide, please. This is a very different picture if we look at the local labor market of Manchester. First of all, next slide, we can observe that Manchester has a stronger specialization in sectors that are slightly more productive than those we observed in Sheffield before. So, for instance, we can see that the city of Manchester has already, for instance, a very high level of specialization in the manufacture of industrial gases, pharmaceuticals, wireless telecommunication services, and so on and so forth. if we would like to diversify towards higher productivity and still related industries, next slide, we can see that the local labor market of Manchester should move towards exactly motion pictures, video and TV program distribution, leasing of intellectual properties, but as well manufacturing of beverages such as distilling, rectifying, blending of spirits. If instead we look specifically, next slide, at the pioneering sector, so those who are not present there yet, it would be very beneficial for the local labor market of Manchester to diversify towards synthetic rubber, ceramic, production of ceramic sanitary fixtures, lime and plaster, for instance. So we can do this exercise basically for virtually all travel to work areas in the UK. And this is what we have developed together with colleagues at BASE by developing basically a dashboard, an interactive dashboard in which it is possible to do the same type of analysis for all travel to work areas. And I'll show you, for instance, just another example, next slide, in which we look instead at one of the most deprived areas in the UK, which is the travel to work area of Blyth and Ashington in Northumberland. So this is a travel to work area which has suffered from deindustrialization, in particular in the 80s, but which is now somehow experiencing some sort of industrial revival, in particular thanks to the development of the offshore wind energy industry in the port of Blyth. So again, next slide, we can see that as in the situation for Sheffield before, this local labor market is mostly specializing in manufacturing sectors with relatively low productivity levels, such as the production of electric wires and cables, other electronic components, but as well services such as inland freight, water transportation. If we would like to exactly help this local labor market to diversify towards higher productivity industries, next slide, we will need instead to move towards more higher productive industries such as passenger water transport or publishing of other services. In terms of pioneering sectors, so those who are not there yet, instead it would be beneficial for this area to diversify towards inorganic chemicals, synthetic rubber, industrial gases, and so on. Next slide. And it's possible for the development of new key targeted industries which are being identified by the EU government as key sectors for future economic growth in the country, in particular in the Plan for Growth published last year. So these sectors are usually exactly linked to life science, for instance, like in this case, but as well clean energy production, creative services, digital services, and fintech, for instance. So I'll give you a couple of examples looking at two different key sectors. So first of all, the life science industry in this slide. So as you can see, first of all, in the map on the left-hand side, we identify local labor markets which are the best suited in terms of the relatedness of these sectors with the existing industrial structure of these places. And as you can see, this is quite evenly distributed across the country. It is true, mostly focusing again in the southeast of the UK, but as well, for instance, in the Midlands and around Manchester and Liverpool. And these sectors are mostly linked to production of pharmaceuticals, but as well, for instance, medical equipment, biotechnologies, and so on and so forth. So in the diagram instead on the right-hand side, what I'm showing there is that exactly we identify travel to work areas which have a high specializations in this sector. So this is the horizontal axis, the RCA. So the farther to the right travel to work area is, the more specialized in these sectors it is already. Instead, on the vertical axis, we show the relatedness density. So how closely related the existing economic structure of these places is to the life science sector. So next slide. So while we observe that exactly travel to work areas in the top right quadrant in this diagram are places that already specialize in these life science sectors, and as well are also have also exactly a local industrial structure which is very close, very similar to the life science industries, we can identify instead other travel to work areas, other local labor markets in the top left quadrant, which have a very high value of related density, so are very have an existing industrial structure which is very similar, very proximate to that needed for the development of life science sectors, but at the moment doesn't still have yet a high degree of specialization. So, for instance, we look at some of these. I'm sorry that it's not. It's quite tiny, but for instance, we see that local labor markets such as those of Leicester, Exeter, and Wolverhampton, for instance, might benefit from a specialization in the life science sectors, given their existing industrial structure. Next slide. We do the same thing, for instance, for the creative industries, same thing as before. Again, we do see that creative industries are currently located mostly in urban areas, but potentially could be closely related to many industries and to the industrial structure of many localities across the UK, both in the south and in the north of the country. If we look at the diagram on the right-hand side, we looked at in the top quadrant, in the top right quadrant, we do observe those cities and places which already have a very high level of specialization in those sectors, such as London, for instance, but as well, we look at High Wycombe or Oxford, I think is there as well. Next slide. If we instead look at the top left quadrant in the diagram, we identify those local labor markets which have a very, which might have a very high potential in developing and specializing in these sectors, based on their existing local industrial structure. In particular, for instance, Manchester, which has a very high degree of related density, so a similarity with the existing local industrial structure, which could benefit a lot by diversifying these key target industries for the future. Next slide, please. So to summarize, basically, this was an exercise we developed in order to try to identify local industrial renewal paths for places across the UK. This is based on the idea that exactly the combination of existing knowledge could support the development of new productive trajectories, in particular for left behind, lacking regions, which would like to exactly, first of all, escape international competition, in particular in those lower end, low added value sectors, and as well promote economic diversification and hence as well promote resilience of these areas. So this is based on the smart specialization strategies, trying to promote exactly a vision of regional growth built around the existing capabilities of places, rather than going ahead with top-down policies, place-neutral policies, which narrowly focus instead on high-tech and high-skill industries. So we try to exactly identify the existing capabilities. We measure how the existing capabilities are related to potential new sectors, and we tried as well to link that into an analysis of the productivity of different sectors in order to understand which sectors might be good candidates for different places across the UK in terms of diversification and increasing gradually productivity levels in those places. So I hope to have convinced you that this might be a good way to try to promote industrial diversification across different places, and this tool could be somehow useful in order to identify which specific sectors different local labor markets should target. Yeah, I think that's it for me. Next slide, please. So thank you again for the next. Yeah, Thank you again for inviting me to this session. So if you want to have a look at the full report, it is available on the Productivity Institute website. Unfortunately, the tool, the dashboard that we developed for this project is not publicly available. It is used mostly internally by BASE. But in case if you would like to have a look at it, I'll be happy to share it with you. As I said, it is all based on publicly available data. And again, I just would like to acknowledge the help and the funding of the ESRC for the secondment. So thank you very much, and happy to answer any question.
Well, thank you very much, Enrico. That was incredibly detailed and interesting. And I remember the first time I saw a sort of a strategy developed, an economic diversification strategy. It was not nearly as detailed and thorough as the work that you've done. And if anybody's interested, it was about 10 years ago. I was looking at an analysis of the Gulf cooperation states, who, of course, their economies were heavily reliant on oil. So when oil prices fell, they would be plunged into recession. So they were looking to diversify their economy. So I completely agree. I think this is a very, very useful tool, certainly to help local areas. And I can see certainly uses for partners across the north when they're developing their own strategies. Now, I do know we do have one or two questions in the chat box. So conscious of time, I won't hog the limelight with my questions. Tom, do you have a question from the chat box?
Yes, absolutely. Firstly, a question from Magda, which is, how do you deal with remote working within your analysis?
Enrico looks like he's frozen.
That's rather unfortunate. That's very unfortunate timing there, but at least we managed to get through Enrico's presentation. It does appear he's frozen on the preview screen as well. So I'm afraid we may have to leave that
and get them back to delegates. So thank you finally to you as delegates for joining us for the Northern Evidence Academic Forum today. And again to our guest speakers. So the next session will be on Wednesday, the 28th of September, and we'll be discussing how we evaluate the impacts of transport interventions and investments. And perhaps we'll be looking at some of that upcoming Transport for the North evidence that we're anticipating publishing in the